uh, in a respectful and comradely manner, and find areas that we have common ground and can sort of form a basis of unity among all of the different strands of leftism that we have, especially at a time like right now with the other devastation and brutality against Palestine and Palestinians. Today we will be discussing two articles, which are Which Way to Socialism by Chris Maizano and Goodbye Revolution by Tim Horace, which cover a strategic debate between the democratic road and the dual power and base building road to socialism. To go more in depth about these two strategies, we have two incredible presenters, Aaron and Matt, who will be covering these articles and facilitating a discussion. And now I will let them introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Matthew Hunter with CPUSA. Before I get started into really getting into the articles, and I think for a lot of us in leftist spaces, this is arguments we've heard quite often. You know, the armed route, the insurrectionist route to revolution, or the peaceful route to revolution. I think democratic is a little bit mystifying the route, to be quite honest. And they both articles present sort of the classical arguments that on the, for Tim Horace and Goodbye Revolution, for the armed route, that our democratic bourgeois society is too oppressive to go that route, or it's even really attempted that much. He does make a clarification that some electoral work is acceptable. And then Chris Maizano obviously brings up the other argument of that the public is not really accepting of armed revolution. It's not really seen as legitimate, so therefore the only route towards revolution is a social revolution through the democratic electoral process. And I think fundamentally, both articles, and this debate, I think misses the point. They mistake strategy, or I should say principle with strategy. Even though they set up the argument that this is a strategic argument, it's very much grounded in principles. That one route or the other is completely off the table. And if you look at any revolutionary struggle, whether it be Yemen, Palestine, even here in the US, there's been different stages of more armed militant struggle, stages of democratic struggle and electoral work, even within the classic Leninist struggles of Russia, China, Vietnam, etc. There's always been a process, a dialectical process between the two. And often I think we sort of stick ourselves through one path, and that limits our struggle greatly. And I think, largely speaking, that's because we think of strategy and tactics in a misconception. Kwame Ture even talked about this with MLK, that he misspoke or mistaken the peaceful route as a principle when it should be a strategy. And strategy obviously is like the ultimate goals we have. Tactics are the experimental things we do to get to those goals. We also think about it from a scale perspective, that, goals we have here locally ultimately are tactics on the national scale and vice versa on the international scale. So when we start thinking about work that needs to be done, we have to start thinking of how to scale up our strategy and tactics. And we have to do that dialectically, and I think that's a lot of the issue with this debate, is that it mistakes an idealist revolution, whether it be social, whether it be armed, with the realities of history. Like the example I said, Yemen, Palestine, those are the ones obviously in the news quite often. If you go back in the history of their struggles, even recently, there's been multiple attempts to go back and forth between armed and peaceful routes. Even like in terms of something that's more comparable for us, even though Palestine is as a settler colonial state. South Africa, the ANC struggle, the South African Communist Party, they had different stages of struggle where they did try democratic electoral work. They went to the armed route. That's why Nelson Mandela went to prison and was declared a terrorist for decades, because he organized militant armed groups. And then they ultimately went the peaceful route. And I think, again, when we look at how things change, both in the class struggle and in our society, when we look at that that quantitative to qualitative shift that we're looking for. I think when we talk about armed or peaceful, the steps to get there are largely similar. We need a broad, progressive front. We need a broad base that supports us, that sees us as legitimate. And that covers a lot of the questions we have, whether it's a social revolution or armed revolution, when we talk about repressive measures by the state. If we have that broad-based support in the communities, in the public, in the working class, in the oppressed nations internally in this country, then the dynamic ultimately shifts. And it becomes a qualitative leap in the struggle drastically. And I think that, again, when we stick to one path, we limit that. Because at some point, it could be possible that the state does bring armed repression against the left. That's not out of the question. And I think that is a legitimate question and discussion that organizations need to have. But it's also not a reality at this point. We have to understand our material conditions, the balance of forces that we have right now. Things have changed since 2020 or even 2016. We did have a much broader united front at some point, with the Bernie campaign. Things have changed, not that the class struggle has degraded itself, it's changed. We see things are much more sporadic and spontaneous, but still gaining organization. For example, LATU, the LA Tenants Union. Big issue here locally is housing rights, is the housing crisis. And LATU has really grown in recent years, grown in the struggle, but they've also grown in militancy. I forget when it was last year at some point, down in Boyle Heights, I know Aaron was there as well, the police attacked LATU and the rally we had. And the public and the community fought back against the police. To pigeonhole us and we're only going to be the peaceful route would necessarily mean that we have to denounce that attempt or denounce that struggle. When that's just us as a community, as a working class, defending ourselves. And that's often when we do resort or have to resort, in terms of history, to armed militant struggle. And again, Tim Horace and Chris Massano present these points, but then they get stuck in changing the strategy to a principle. That at some point, maybe our tactics change, maybe our strategies change. But our principle is always to get to a socialist horizon. It's always to get to a socialist revolution, whatever that may look like. That's all determined on the mass public. That's all determined on our material conditions. And what that socialist experiment looks like is, again, built on our material conditions. And I think a lot of this argument is reductive. It leads us astray. The work that needs to be doing now is to build that broad mass progressive front. Because those of us that are more peaceful and democratic, then you have that base to win elections. For those that ultimately think that this might go awry and we need an armed struggle, you had that broad base for support and to legitimize you. You see that in a lot of issues with armed struggles today, is that, some of these armed struggles, let's say in the Philippines or whatever they be, they lack somewhat of public support. And it's not mean that they're wrong, I'm not going to denounce their struggle, but that's why these struggles have continued for so long in this one stage. It has not advanced to another leap, another stage of development. And I think, again, we have to think about this dialectically, because things will shift, things will change, and obviously we can't make the revolution. I think that's a little bit a part of this issue. The idea of if we organize militias and organize armed groups, then boom, we get a revolution. That's not how it works. If you even hear comrades from South Africa and their struggle and their history, and they did both, they often will tell you, it's not as simple as just walking around handing guns to the community. It has to be organized on every level, whether it's electoral work and peaceful, or whether it's armed, insurrectionist, or whatever it may be, militant, it has to be organized. And that's where we come in, as the organized left. That this struggle is going to be determined by the broad mass base, but we can influence it, we can organize it, we can add revolutionary consciousness to it. And it's not to tail the public, it's not to tail the masses, because obviously sometimes the masses do get reactionary, but it's to also understand our balance of forces. If the masses aren't behind us, then we have to get them behind us. And sometimes that's electoral work, and you often will hear, even in Chris Masano's article, sort of a denouncement of the Leninist route. But if you read Stalin or Lenin, they even talk about elections, you know, like Stalin, the most, I would say, infamous of them, you know, he talks about, hey, everyone has universal suffrage. It's your duty to vote. It's your duty to use this as a means of struggle. So I don't want us to limit ourselves as organized left. And I think this argument naturally starts to limit our struggle. But I think that's about it. Aaron?
Yeah. I'll probably just take it off. My name is Aaron Novellis. Sorry, I'm like, ooh. Sorry about that. My name is Aaron Novellis. I'm with the Peace and Freedom Party. I'm a teacher just down the street on Western. And I'm also a congressional candidate, open socialist, third-party congressional candidate for the 34th District. I don't think we were at the Community of the Islands, did we? Okay. I think it's cool. I'll do it just so we can get that out of the way. So the educational series is meant to raise the level of understanding of the fundamental debates within the left, both for the people new to politics and for experienced organizers. The discussions are expected to be respectful of political disagreements, which will certainly not be resolved in a single discussion, and will persist beyond this series. Personal attacks and long-winded tirades will not be tolerated. Good faith critiques of other leftist, theoretical, and practical work are encouraged. If these guidelines are not followed, the people violating them will be asked to leave the space. I wanted to get started when I was reading these two articles. I kind of pinned it as what kind of argument is this? Because, you know, it's not just there's base building and democratic road to socialism. There's like 100 different socialist or communist groups with 100 different strategies, even though we agree on 99% of things. So I pinned it down. This is really more like a DSA, Bread and Roses caucus specifically take versus kind of a left communist take. Because when I was reading Maisano's article, Which Way to Socialism, like I agreed with him on some aspects. Like he was arguing that the insurrectionary, wait for the police to come attack us and attack back. That's not the way we're going to do it. And I agreed with him. But I feel like he really misinterpreted Tim Horace's article, because Tim Horace did not say we should only, arm ourselves, wait, and fight for revolution. He did talk about base building. He did talk about getting organized and making sure we were ready, and that we should defend ourselves and prepare us for counter-revolutionary violence. And I think Maisano just really focused on the, insurrection, arm ourselves, fight back. And he didn't really go deeper into Maisano's other arguments. And I really do agree with his arguments that, as socialists, we should take up the electoral route. We should, at times be legitimate in the government eyes. But then he talks about that we shouldn't, we shouldn't tell the people that there could be revolutionary violence, that we don't know how to be prepared for that. And, it's a gamble, and at the end he talks about it. It's like, it's a wager we have to wage which way it's going to go. And just like Matt said, I don't think it's either or. We have multiple tools in the toolbox. And, sometimes we're going to take the electoral route, take that route, but we're going to do all those things at the same time. We're going to have the electoral route, we're going to be base building in our workers' organizations, in our tenants' organizations, in our unions. And I think what Maisano fundamentally misunderstands is that he's coming from a point where he's making these arguments that a party should be going out to the masses and talking to them about elections, revealing our enemies for what they truly are. But his organization doesn't really do that, especially here in Los Angeles, when he talks about we should once we get elected, we should reveal who our true enemies are. But we saw in Los Angeles, once the DSA LA electeds got into positions of power, instead of revealing our true enemies, which was the Democrats in city council, because they make out 14 out of 15 seats, they shake hands with them in photo ops. They, vote for police budgets. They vote for a Democrat to be a president of the city council. And then I'm just like, I wonder if, because this was written in 2019, if this is what he meant when he wrote that. I know this is not what he meant. So I don't know if it's specifically just DSA LA or the national org in general, but I really wish that some of the arguments he made here, his organization followed through with. And also, I don't like how when he's talking about Horace, because this whole article is just him like focusing on Horace. He talks about, if we go too radical, if we go too much towards the insurrectionary route, the capitalist state is going to attempt to oppress us. The capitalist state is going to try to squash us. But I mean, we don't even have to take that route for the capitalist state to try to squash us. We're in a coalition, Matt and I and some other activists in Southeast LA called the Southeast LA for Palestine, and we went to a Pico Rivera meeting, and there was undercover cops there. And we weren't doing anything illegal, we weren't doing anything too radical, we were just going to city council asking them for a ceasefire. And it's funny because I didn't even realize there were undercover cops until the next day we went to Montebello City Council, and I saw one of the women there that I saw yesterday. It was a man and a woman. I asked them why they were there, just so I can get to know people. And they told me they were Cal State LA students. And then the next day I see that same woman in an officer uniform. And I was like, okay, no matter what we're doing, the state is going to attempt to repress us. They're going to try to find out what we're doing. They're going to try to intimidate us. So even if we take the revolutionary or legal route, that's what's going to happen. Another way with taking the legal route that I wish Chris Maisano pushed further is that if we look at the Socialist Party, 100 years ago, when they were doing so well in Milwaukee, taking control of the entire city council, winning state assembly seats, when they elected someone for Congress, Congress just didn't let that person take that seat. And that was totally the legal route. They won an election, but they just prevented them from taking the seat. So it's just because we go the legal electoral route, that doesn't mean they're going to be legal and okay with us. They're going to take their way to stop us any way they can. So I think Maisano fundamentally misunderstands what it's going to take for the state to start repressing us, but also what the state will do illegally to stop us if we take the legal route. And then I think overall with both articles, we just saw that struggle of not a road to a democratic socialist revolution, but a road with a social democratic reformist way to revolution, and kind of this base building approach where I think we've kind of proved that the base building approach doesn't work, even here in LA. Like in LA, we have a bunch of bases, right? We have bases that follow like Black Lives Matter, we have bases with the Los Angeles Tenants Union, we have bases in environmental groups, we have bases with student groups, labor groups, but all of our groups are separated. They're very weak on our own. We have all these different struggles with a handful of people fighting for it. I mean, some of these groups, yeah, they're really big, and we have other groups that are, 10 people, 5 people, 20 people, but it's still so separated that these bases never get that big. And without any victories, these bases get disgruntled. These bases get tired. We get burnt out. When we have a victory, it's reinvigorating. And I really think the electoral approach could help us win some of those victories to alleviate some of the burnout that's happened. And I think the electoral approach, if done correctly, can unify these bases together. Because now not only am I just fighting for tenants, or that person over there is just fighting to defund the police, and that person's over there is fighting for a Green New Deal or healthcare. Now we're all fighting together for all of our our program or all of our goals united together. So instead of having 20 people in one area of the city fighting for their goal, now we have 500 people across the city organized together fighting for a program under a party. And I just think it'd be really weird if we're like in a party fighting together and not running candidates. Because as this is my second time running for a seat, I've ran for school board and now I'm running for Congress. And I've knocked on doors for other things, canvassing for other things, like getting people to sign up to learn more about the sheriff gangs. And like people kind of like, they don't care about it. But when you knock on their door saying that you're running for a campaign, they actually listen to you. Because they know like, hey, I probably will vote, I probably won't. But like this person like actually has some type of like kind of certificate of saying like, oh, this person's actually talking to me about something, they're not trying to sell me something, or I'm like confused about what they're trying to talk about. They're like, I know elections happen, so that's why this person's here, and they'll actually hear you out for a couple minutes. And I think that's one interjection you can make and start talking about, like, oh, I see there's apartments around here. Is the landlord raising rent too much? Is the conditions great? And you're like, hey, there's this local organization that's fighting for this stuff. And that's really where we can use elections as a way to build the bases around the city that might have not otherwise happened. Because maybe I didn't hear about the tenant march that was going on, but someone came to my door and talked to me about elections, and I know that one of the groups that helps in those elections is a tenant group, so now I'm connected. Or just like in any fight that I care about, universal health care, someone's talking to me, and I know not only is this candidate fighting for that, but also they have a specific organization that cares about that. I might not join that candidate, I might not volunteer for them, but I know like, hey, I might go and join that group. And I think that really like unifies our struggle all together, because if that's one way we can just knock on regular people's doors and tell them there's a unified organization around the entire city, not just fighting for one thing, but fighting for these 10, 20 things that I also believe in. And I think that's really powerful, because if I like walk into a room and I see 5, 10 people that are gonna work towards something, I'm like, that's not gonna get done in a city as big as Los Angeles. But if I see that there's 10, 20 groups, all with 10, 20 people working together, then that just seems so much more possible to me. To get back to the articles, my last point that I wanted to make is that the United States is still a pre-democratic society, especially compared to a lot of European social democracies that are referenced. Like when we look at Europe and South America, Central America, their democracies have proportional representation, where workers can start their own organizations and they can get 1-2% of the vote and get a seat in the assembly. Where in the United States, we have the winner-take-all system, no proportional representation. We have the Senate, which was just a slave owner. A slave owner-led thing, just so that the slave states can keep power. Our Constitution was made by slave owners in a way that the slave-owning states can stop any real working class or any real liberation movement from pushing too much change. So I think one thing we need to focus on is, if we want revolution, we need to explore the electoral route to break down these the slave-owning constitution and these slave senates. Because if we don't get rid of the Senate, if we don't get rid of our constitution and create a new one that is for people, it's going to be extremely harder for us to push for revolution outside of electoral realm, just in an insurrectionary approach. And one thing I would like to give my son is he said that if we try to fund mutual aid programs, if we try to fund neighborhood defense, if we try to fund these legal teams without an electorally approach, would go broke really quick. Because I mean, we have all these things we donate to, these legal funds, bookstores, but like we're broke ourselves, and we can't keep that going forever. we can't expand it. But if we took an electoral approach, and let's say just at the city level, take some of these seats and put that money towards housing the homeless, feeding the homeless, even work with these, stores and bookstores and other programs we already got, and put our resources, put the elected officials, organizers towards there to kind of alleviate our own money that we have to put in there so we can put it towards other things, grow the possibility of what we can work with. I think that's one thing that we can do that Maisano made a good point on. But I think I'm going to pass it over to Matthew, and I think you had a couple things to say about the overall, both articles.
I mean, not really. I mean, I think you made some really good points. I'd rather open it up to the rest of the people and get their thoughts on it.
So we're going to run a microphone for anyone who wants to speak. So just raise your hand and we can run that to you. Let me actually grab Nato to do this. Anyone? I guess I'll go first. Something that I found interesting, like I've been so upset with electoralism. I was literally, I'm in the camp that's like, fuck that shit, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter. No one that runs is ever gonna follow through. Something that I did learn though, just from researching other successful communist parties worldwide, a lesson I learned from the Irish Communist Party is that they run candidates not expecting to win. They know they're not going to win. But they still put candidates out there to be able to talk to people in a time when they're feeling like people are politically engaged. So a lot of the times when we do run candidates, like I know you're running, we've got Lalo, we've got a couple other ones I can't think of right now because I'm nervous. But it's a lot of people who think when you're running somebody, like a third-party president, for example, like Claudia and Karina campaign, a lot of people are like, how do you expect to win? There's no way you're going to win against Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And like, I think that people miss the point that it's not necessarily about winning as much as it is engaging with the masses and offering them an alternative. So as much as like I think we're all super disenfranchised and hate the electoral route, I think that that's also something that, like you said, is a tactic and not an end-all be-all strategy.
I'll be passing the mic, so if you want to talk, raise your hand. I agree with the idea that running candidates should be about using the state's platform that it gives you to otherwise talk to people that you would never be in contact with. Perfect example of that would be my most recent campaign was Albert Corrado, who was a very, very heavy abolitionist candidate. We didn't think we were going to win, but having the ability to not only use that as a funnel to talk about things that people would normally not talk about, but thinking about the fact that there were abolitionists being paid by state funds in order to go out and talk to people. That's something you can't normally get through mutual aid or base building, right? But I do agree that the electoral process itself is doomed. We cannot win there. It has to be used as a propaganda tool, as a way to point out the contradictions of capital and state. As for the articles, like I felt as if, from mine on, there was a couple of bad faith arguments for me in the sense that, like you said, he's writing from a DSA platform where he says, like, oh, we shouldn't fully write out of hand the idea of an armed struggle. Meanwhile, the DSA is actively trying to disarm people. They are actively supporting candidates who want to take guns from the working class people. And I fully disagree with that. So how on one hand you can say we need to keep these things in mind for if and when we have these political successes, when at the same time you're campaigning through a party that wants to take the very tools of that away from the masses. So I think that like that was one of the things where I heard from Mazzano that didn't really make much sense to me. For the eventual downfall and degradation that will come within the United States. I mean, we're already starting to see it, especially now as a presidential campaign is going on. They're already starting to take advantage of that, to polarize more, to bring more people who otherwise wouldn't be involved in a political struggle to the right? Because there is no broad left coming out giving actual solutions to these problems. Like, a perfect example for me is the thing going down at the Texas border right now. We all know that's bullshit. We all know it's just a way for racists to be able to be more fucking racists, right? But there's nobody at the top saying that if we want people to not be worried about an immigration crisis, then we need to stop fucking exploiting the global south. Like, you can't have one without the other, and we don't have a left pushing that forward. And that's where I see, like, both are inherent. Like, you need people who are going to be pushing for an armed struggle for when all of the state apparatuses break down and they ultimately give it over to the paramilitary that they're absolutely going to do. You need forces that are ready to stand up and say, we're ready now. Not when some ideological successes come down the road. Like, we need to be ready now to defend our communities at this very second, because you can never know when it's going to happen. You know, they sit there and they say that throughout the article, is that like, we can't, as DSA or as anybody, figure out when it's going to happen or what the formula is going to look like. But when it does happen, it's usually no one knows it's going to. It happens in a fucking spark. And unless you're ready for it, then it just takes you over.
Also, I forgot to mention too, we're going to try to keep comments today under 3 minutes so that everyone can speak. Just look to me, I'll be timing, and I'll give you guys three, 2, and then 1. And then if you could just respect that, that would be fantastic, just so we can get more people speaking. So if anyone else wants to make a comment, or if you guys want to respond, how do we... If we can just keep the discussion going.
So yeah, I think it's a good point about not necessarily wanting to win. I think in a lot of situations, winning could actually be a disaster. Like, let's take Bernie Sanders. I think a lot of us got into this again because of Bernie Sanders. If he had won, he wouldn't have been able to accomplish what he told people he was going to accomplish. Supreme Court, the Senate, the Democratic Party all would have thwarted any attempts at reform. And then imagine if he was president now, he would definitely be supporting the Israeli genocide against Gaza. That would fracture, destroy the left. It would demoralize people severely. You know, with DSA, I think in the article by Bread and Roses, there's an argument that we need to win elections because that's going to build our forces. And DSA-LA has endorsed candidates on the city council. But at the same time, DSA is facing a huge budget crisis. We're facing declining membership. So it's not this cure-all to just endorse people and have them win and then have them get into office and not do what they said they were going to do, because the realities of electoral politics in the United States is you get in, you make backroom doors that are secret from the membership, and then the people that supported you feel betrayed. And getting voters does not equate getting people to become socialists. There's a disconnect there. You know, that's all I have.
Hello, my name is Jess, pronouns they, them, there, and I'm a member of the Freedom Socialist Party. We're a feminist, revolutionary, socialist organization. I really appreciate the thoughts on synthesizing these strategies and recognizing them as strategies as opposed to principles. But I do, I'm more inclined to agree with the Horace article, obviously. But a lot of this synthesization that y'all are bringing up reminds me of Trotsky's transitional program, which essentially yes ands reform. It says, yes, we're going to fight for these reforms and probably make the demands even more robust as to actually give to give breathing room for the working class to operate and build our revolution. But and we acknowledge that some of those reforms we might win, a lot of them we might not. And either way, it's still a process to radicalize the working class, to encourage participation and say, like, hey, when the capitalist class does not let us get this thing or do this thing, first of all, expect that they're going to fight back hard. And two, this is what we do next. So one, I think that's why a party is really important. And two, it acknowledges that those systems, those political systems that already exist, that is where people are. That is where the majority of the working class is already participating. For example, I used to work for the Democratic Party. You can boo me if you want, but I did end up in this space because someone, when I became demoralized, was able to reach out to me and say, hey, this is what the revolution actually looks like. You had all these good intentions, and that's what led you to this bourgeois, electoral system. But this is how we actually get the things that we want as a working class. That's all. Thank you.
Oh yeah, we're gonna have a response.
This comes a little bit from. So I'm not running just with the Peace and Freedom Party. We created this coalition called New Democracy between Peace and Freedom, LA Moss, Midnight Books, and kind of like the People's Education Program. We're working on that more. But what we really envision this is that, oh, my notes, they're like copying down what I'm saying. It's going to be super long. All right. Is that we fundamentally disagree that winning positions isn't bad. It is bad when you're doing it through the Democratic Party, when you are the most left-wing organization and your coalition is being built to the right. But when we're building our coalition from ourselves and the people around us and to the left, with worker organizations, with abolitionists, it's a lot easier to keep those candidates accountable. And what I mean by that is, I read like a 20-page pamphlet. It's called Lenin as Campaign Manager. And his best elected officer in the Duma was an undercover police agent because of how they held their electeds accountable. Any speech you made in the Duma, or let's just say in Congress, to make it so we can understand better, every speech you made in Congress was created by the party. It wasn't created by the candidate, because the candidate's just a mouthpiece for the party. If you're doing it correctly, if you're an organized socialist Marxist party. Every bill that's put up, the party will try to amend it to make it revolutionary. Every bill that, you're not writing the bill, the party's writing the bill, you're putting it up. Every speech you make is put up. Every vote you take is voted on by the party. And then that is how an undercover cop, they can't do anything. They're forced to take these revolutionary routes or else they're exposed. So any elected should be, it's just acting on the party. And if you have a coalition of different organizations, social movements, worker organizations, and these socialists holding this person accountable and they go against what the party wants, that entire coalition falls apart. And then maybe 9 out of 10, those 10 coalition groups will not back that candidate next time. Where here is if you, all right, well, screw DSA, I'm not going to go with their program, but everyone to the right of me agrees with what I'm doing. Now my coalition, I'm just throwing out DSA, but I still have 9 out of the 10 other groups in my coalition. So I think we can keep electeds accountable, and we can, if it's in an organized, independent party.
A few comments to the last two that made comments. I think that we have to be honest here that we want wins. You know, like there is a part of like elections and the work we do that is symbolic, that's just about mobilizing masses, that we understand it's not everything we're going to do is going to have a material effect at the end of the day. But we still want a material effect at the end of the day. And so I feel like there's a tendency within leftist groups that do run elections that they're just like, oh, it doesn't matter if we win or not. And I don't understand that, to be quite honest. The point is to win the struggle. Whether it's an electoral struggle, a labor struggle, the point is to win. Losses set us back drastically. Think about all the money, the resources, the time, and energy that you put into an electoral campaign. If you lose that, you lose all that time, all that money, all the energy. It's wasted. That's a reality. You know, there's a very limited sense of like elections can, you know, build consciousness and mobilization. It's a very limited tactic. There's an aspect to it that's true, yes, but it's limited. So for example, like the Bernie Sanders campaign, I think if he won, it would have been great. It would have been much better for us. Would that have been a revolution? Absolutely not. Would have been better than Biden? I think so. I think it would have been better than Biden. And in terms of reforms, revolution, I think, you know, Lenin, Stalin, even Mao, I mean, they're pretty clear that reforms are important. That to mitigate the harm and the pain, the exploitation, the oppression on the working class and oppressed peoples is important. It's all building steps towards a revolution. Like I said, the goal is to win. So we have to always keep that in hindsight, whether it's an election, whether it's a mutual aid effort. The point is still to win the struggle. I think that in regards to Aaron's points about DSA, and there's a couple people have brought it up, their ineffectiveness when it comes to post-election wins. I think we have to be honest with ourselves. And I know this might be an uncomfortable topic for some people on the left, but those will all be mitigated with democratic centralism. If the idea that the collective had a vote on it, this is sort of what Aaron's talking about, if the collective votes on it and it passes, then the entire collective is assumed to follow through on it. If you break that, you're breaking party line. So when AOC, you know, not just recently, but years ago, was like, maybe we should have an intervention in Haiti. You know, like that would be a clear violation of TSA policy. You're up for either discipline or removal of the organization. These are simple things to fix organizations. When we talk about organizing the struggle, we have to organize ourselves first. And if we're all just eclectic groups, and that's sort of what Terrence's point about we're all different bases, then it becomes really difficult. And, you know, I see that a little bit with coalition work too, is that, you know, you get certain actors or certain organizations that are much more active, and they're the ones sort of determining policy because they're the ones that are the most active, and other organizers get left out. And there isn't really that democratic process. And I think that has to be really the foundation of our organizing, is that we are a collective. We move as a collective. When I think about elections, I think about winning them. I don't think about just necessarily losing them. So how can we as a collective fully concentrate our material effort to win this? You know, when I think of Lalo, I think he has a great chance of winning. Or the best chance of any slate of candidates we have locally. You know, would it be better, no offense, Aaron, if we all stopped running different elections and all focus on Lalo? You know, he has UAW support. That's massive. Like, think about how rare it is to get a union endorsement as a socialist candidate, an out-and-out socialist candidate. It's rare nowadays. You know, I think in terms of that type of work, we need to look at concentrating effort, concentrating forces, and think about it from a more local perspective. I think national elections, I understand them, but they're very, very difficult. I think it's much more possible to win local political power and then build local bases. Because let's say, you know, society crumbles, let's say the worst happens. It'd be good if LA was a local socialist base. That would be nice. I would love that, you know. You know, it would help out even on a national scale if we had pockets of real strong political power. Because then we can get economic power. That's how we do it.
Hi, yeah, so a lot of what I was going to say was actually touched on, so thank you guys for those comments. That was really insightful. But I guess I did also just want to jump on this point of accountability, right? We see like a bunch of, I guess, DSA electeds, for example, because, you know, they're out there, and we have people like Jamal Bowman, like funding Iron Dome and like other sorts of things like Israel. We have, you know, I think it's kind of wild out here that we have people. Oh no. Hello. Hello. Okay. That we have like, what was it? Like, oh yeah, AOC out here still advocating to vote for Biden, which is like, I don't know, the cognitive dissonance for that is like crazy to me. But, so like this form of like accountability is something that if you don't have, it kind of makes whatever sort of like endorsements or whatever, like this whole idea of like a DSA slate of candidates kind of like almost like a joke to some degree, because it's like, what are you, like, how do you even know you can trust these candidates to uphold the positions that you're supposedly electing them for? And I guess I wanted to just get to like a point of, I'm not, I guess, super familiar with like how involved some of these electeds are with DSA before they do get elected, so I'm not necessarily going to comment on anyone specific other than, let's say, someone like Bernie Sanders, right, which I'm pretty sure was like a rank and file like DSA member leading up to 2016. So Bernie gets elected, it's 2016, 2020, whatever, let's just say this happened, right? What sort of accountability does Bernie Sanders have? What sort of accountability is there to make sure that he's, you know, fulfilling his promises or just keeping in line with like socialist ideas, right? Not selling out, or I guess now we have to work, we would have worried about like him supporting the genocide in Gaza, right? So I just wanted to focus, I guess, on like the importance of like promoting like rank and file members who are actually accountable to some degree, rather than looking outside for people who are like, oh, that's close enough, right? Like we can work with these people. And I guess that also brings up like the role of the Democratic Party. I mean, we live in this really weird system where it's not like a parliamentary system where we basically really only have two parties, and we have third parties that try to break through, but that's like incredibly hard. And, you know, I guess I don't necessarily have the solution, but we definitely have to stop treating the Democratic Party, I feel like, as a just way to get people elected, I guess, because then you have people, I just saw this like clip on Twitter where it was like AOC being like, yeah, I'm not really happy with Biden, but because she's a member of the Democratic Party, I guess she's like, but you know, like no one's perfect, and I'm just like, I just don't know how to resolve that. But anyways, I guess that's all I was going to say.
I think our comrade from CPUSA made a great point in the beginning of our discussion, that is, we have to analyze the material conditions that we're living in. And unfortunately, at this stage in the United States, the reactionary forces are overwhelmingly stronger than the forces of socialism, communism, however you want to put it, revolutionary forces. Therefore, I think the strategy of the movement, the tactics of the movement, have to be, first of all, to survive, and then to grow our bases. And maybe I'm limited in the area of coming up with how we can build this movement via sort of an armed struggle route, let's say. So in using, let's examine the road of electoralism, I think we must not fall into the trap of the bourgeois mind being, oh, it's all about winning the election, it's all about getting our people in there, about party politics. It's about building a revolutionary party, and to accomplish that, we use electoral strategies to not, as Lenin outlines in many of his works, the most important thing is to have a propaganda outlet. And I think running elections can do that. And I do take your point about that maybe not being the most cost-effective way, but I think there are merits to that. And we can analyze situations like case by case, whether running a candidate here would be beneficial or not. So I think everything should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's how we preserve the movement and potentially grow it. Yeah.
If I can, one brief reply. I think that the idea, because I see this a lot also on the left, that like we need to build like a revolutionary party. I feel like there's a few out there. I feel like there's quite a few out there. Whether it's and they all have their issues. I mean, that's one thing that I think we have to sort of get off the table, is this idea that our organization has to be perfect. It's not gonna be. There's gonna be interpersonal issues, there's gonna be conflicts, contradictions, and that's just how it works. It's a very small scale of the class struggle in a way, or the inter-class struggle with the working class. Obviously I'm CPUSA, but there's also PSL, there's also FRSO, and even though it's been a little bit of us, shitting on DSA here, I think their issue is not ideological so much. I think their issue is organization. The fact that they cannot have accountability with their members, with their endorsements, it runs into this significant contradiction where you're saying one thing and the opposite's happening. And I think that's a large part of why we've seen about 20,000 people left DSA in the last year or so. It's because the DSA has been pushing for one thing or a few things, because I know there's different caucuses, but they've been pushing for a really radical shift in politics. They have. But they're not organized like these other organizations are. PSL, FRSO, CPUSA, they all have democratic centralism. So there is that accountability that's built into the system. Like I'm an elected exec in our club in Southeast LA. At any time, Danny here, working the camera, can propose that I be removed from office. At any time. Anytime. And there's a process for that. I don't think DSA has that. And I think that's a fundamental issue. But I do think there are revolutionary groups. There are revolutionary organizations. I think people need to stop worrying about creating their own and start worrying about working with these organizations we have and finding a path towards revolution, because it's there. I mean, these organizations have been around, CPUSA has been around for 100 years plus. PSL has been around, I think, for at least 3 decades. 21? 20 years. FRSO, I think it's been around the same amount of time. They've been, and obviously the members there have been in the struggle for even longer. Like Frank Chapman was in CPUSA, he's now one of the leaders of FRSO. He's a significant, long-time class leader in the struggle in Chicago. Like there's decades of experience out there. We need to build upon that instead of looking for our own special, like, third way. I think that limits us drastically.
Hey guys. Testing? Okay. Yeah, great presentations, great comments so far. I wanted to just point to what I think is the most significant contribution from the Maisano article, which is the problem of the legitimacy of the state. And this is his critique of Oris, is that Oris downplays how legitimate the state is in the eyes of American people, namely, or significantly, in the eyes of the working class. If what we're waging is a struggle for hegemony, for socialist hegemony, what we want is hegemony within the working class. We want to be seen as legitimate leaders by the working class. We want to develop socialist leaders from the working class into the ranks of whatever socialist formation we put together. And Ora spent some time in his article pointing out how undemocratic the United States is. But that is not necessarily the key factor in how legitimate the United States state is in people's eyes. Biden has a very low approval rating. Let's take this for an example. Everyone knows that Biden is arguably, 10 strokes into his first term as president. Can barely put a sentence together. He's falling down all over the place. He is still seen as the legitimate president of the United States. People recognize him as the president. They recognize the Supreme Court as a serious governing body with serious power. They recognize the Senate, the Congress, even local political positions as legitimate positions of power. They do not see an alternative to this power emerging that they find legitimate. And this is what the Maisano piece is pointing to, is this problem of the consolidation of state power in the 20th century. And what do socialists do about that? And that's a very difficult question. And so I think what Maisano, if we just take his argument, distill his argument to the best version of what it is. Let's take away the problems that have been pointed out with the DSA. Let's take away his own role, potentially, in the problems of how the DSA functions. What he's saying is we need to develop a legitimate political struggle. And part of that is pursuing elections, which the working class views as legitimate forms of, obtaining political power. And by doing that, we do two things. I don't know if he articulates this in the article. We build political experience within the working class. We show the working class what it means to wage a political struggle, to engage in politics, to see itself as a political subject. And when we face repression, we expose the illegitimacy of the state, of the capitalist state. And I think that by doing these two things, we actually see quite a bit of value in pursuing an electoral strategy, as long as, like many of the speakers have pointed out, we do it in the correct way, in a very disciplined way, in a very intentional way, and not in an opportunistic way, which unfortunately has been the pattern most recently in socialist efforts electorally.
Then back here.
Oh, hello. The Maisano article says something about how it is a big wager to focus on revolutionary defense and base building and waiting for the perfect rupture crisis to happen. And I find that very ironic because I feel like the democratic socialist road is quite a huge wager, and that having a functioning working class base and democracy are your social security. Because when we think about accountability and opportunity, I think, for the millionth time, people have mentioned DSA as embodying that. And I think that's what I find as the problem with, I think, a disproportionate focus on the electoral road at this point in time, because I also disagree with the assertion, or rather, Maisano's disproportionate focus on electoralism as an arena for political expression to the working class. Because, I don't know, could we go to a working class neighborhood and ask around, have you heard of DSA? Have you heard of DSA? Have you heard of socialism? What is socialism? Is there a socialist organization helping you with your problems in this neighborhood, in the city? And another jab at DSA. I think we have to investigate, the class character of these orgs, and I think if it's an org with like DSA with a middle class bourgeois character, then I feel like that they're not being held accountable by an actual existing working class base, such as what we're seeing in the current moment between Latu and Hugo Soto Martinez, who proclaims himself as pro-tenant but is always 10 steps behind the union. And what is somewhat of a crisis now with the homelessness crisis, which the left has lost because sweeps and speculative real estate are what's dominating the conversation. Anyway, I'm rambling on that point, but I think in summary, just to ask yourself, when we focus on electoral road, how much protagonism are we taking away from a working class hypothetical base when we're telling them you need to depend on these smarter, more educated, activist middle class, plus the politicians they represent to solve your problems, and you can't fix your own problems.
Let's go now.
Hello? I'm Corinne. There's like a bunch of different points. I'll try to tie it all together in my head. But yeah, I agree that focusing on local politics over national politics is super important. In the second article, it said, they said, instead, strategy must be rooted in what Lenin referred to as a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. And I feel like so-called United States is so big, like national politicians, they live in abstraction, they live in the vague, that's how they succeed, that's how they, people make compromises they wouldn't otherwise make. To a lot of other people's points, like knowing a specific community's issues, which is going to be drastically different than any other part of the so-called United States, like that's where local politics thrive. And I feel like the second article also really persuaded me versus the first one, because they acknowledge settler colonialism, and I'm like, if we don't even acknowledge how these United States was created, like, if we don't acknowledge that, then how can we trust anyone to lead us? Like, it's just, we can't copy paste Marxism from Russia, we have to understand our own conditions. So that's just like broad conditions. And then there's like hundreds of indigenous nations within the so-called United States. So if we don't even, so I just feel like there's so many specifics that need to be paid attention to. And to echo, I've been listening to Decolonize Buffalo. I know they've worked with Midnight Books. They've got some really, really great stuff. And to their point, they say like the vanguard comes from the reservation. So I just felt like that would be worthwhile to mention too.
Okay, I think it's definitely worthwhile to build a party, to run in elections, but I think what's more important is to educate how the state is a tool of the elite in the first place. I don't know what would happen if we actually got a socialist president, but if we even got that far, or more socialists, maybe we get PSL Congress members. But in every case, as we see, we have candidates making all of these promises before they get into office, and then once they're in office, they do things that nobody understands, like AOC and Rashida Tlaib voting yes on House Bill 888. And there's questions did they do that because of the threat of AIPAC, of Israeli, PAC money, trying to either directly funding them or threatening to take them down and fund their opponents? The entire electoral process is run by capital. I mean, why do we still have fossil fuel being heavily subsidized? And getting people to recognize that the state, even though the working class sees it as legitimate, the state is a tool of the elite to enact their oppression. Who is it that shows up at the apartment when it's time to evict you? It's the state. And if people continue to think of the state as the only legitimate way to enact change or for them to get a better life, then that's where we need to start in terms of educating, like, that the entire system that we have is not built to serve them. It's built to serve the interests of capital. We ultimately have a dictatorship of capital. And I think that is what needs to be, like, whether we do it through an electoral campaign or whether we do it through viral videos or art or whatever, like, that needs to be a big part of the conversation too. Rather than just working within the electoral system to actually say, hey, this system was never built for us in the first place. The system was never meant to serve us. So how can we take down that system?
Thank you. So I think that as Marxists, well, I don't know. Some people might have different ideas on this stuff, but I think generally we don't like the state. And the state, not only like this concrete state, the American United States, but the state itself, right, as an institution. Marxism begins recognizing the dictatorship of capital, as you said, and also just sort of the state form as a form that doesn't emancipate the working class. So we all understand that. And we can all agree on that, and I think we can all take the next step also of saying, despite that, just like Coley was saying, there's legitimacy encoded, right, into the institution of the state. There's not just legitimacy in an ideological sense, but in a material sense of sort of the power that the state commands, right, resource-wise, materially, and so on. So we have to negotiate with the state. I think that we can all take the step too to say that the state is important as a sort of form of like propaganda. I think people are pretty satisfied with that. We understand that. Questions come up when we talk about how effective we can be in making inroads into the state, policy, and so on and so forth. Questions begin to emerge there, right? And I think those questions are not only just theoretical, but they ultimately depend on the concrete conjuncture. Someone was quoting Lenin. And I think how far we can make certain inroads into the state depends on how powerful the working class movement is. How much it can, because the more inroads you make into the state, the more backlash you receive from capitalist powers. I have 1 minute? Damn. And that sucks. So you need the working class on the streets, right, to keep being able to push forward, eventually to rupture and destroy the state. But wow, that was part one. Part two is basically, I'm happy that, so we get it. So the working class needs to be there to support our movements in the state. So the first couple comments, I was listening, but I was a little dissatisfied with the fact that we were talking so much just about like we need the working class behind us. Do we? The question is not should we run people and say? I feel like if we're mature enough, we know we have to. Propaganda, blah blah blah. We get it. Of course, we have to run elections at some point, right now, whatever. But do we actually have the working class to back us up in those moves in the state? And what are we going to do right now to gain more of the working class? Because we have very, very little legitimacy with the working class as it exists outside of the state.
Hi. I think I think he has a good point. The state does, legitimate itself with its power, so there's no other choice but to negotiate with it. And since this state claims to be a democracy, I think the way we enter that democracy is pointing out the undemocratic characteristics of it, right? If AOC failed us, it's because undemocratic process inside the Democratic Party, super delegates. We have the Electoral College, we have all these undemocratic things, and democracy is the friend of the working class, I think, right? That's what, leftism is. Just 200 miles away, there's a country that has elected a leftist president, has reduced poverty to 9 million people, providing health care to people that have never had any, providing pensions, well, Social Security, they call that pensions over there, but people that have never received money. And so how do they do it? They politicize their government, make undemocratic processes more democratic, pointed them out when they weren't. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. His strategy was an anti-corruption strategy, which I think would work really well here. It hasn't worked, people still relate to corporations and these institutions and money interests that are gonna naturally corrupt candidates. So,
Turn it on and off.
yeah, my.
Turn it on and off.
I have another.
I think this, oh yeah, it's working.
We work within the state, and just those 2 points. We got to make the process more democratic. We have to fight the apathy in the left and in our apathetic, regular, apolitical population. That the state doesn't, that we have to, work and create some dual power outside the state. I mean, that's what I do. I work with Food Not Bombs. I work with all these other groups, and that's 70% of my activist time. But I still pay very much attention to politics because it's real and it's there, so we have to deal with it. Thank you.
Here.
Hi, I'm Val Carlson with the Freedom Socialist Party. I'd like to thank our speakers for clarifying and elaborating on the articles and putting the broader issues before us. I think the articles kind of went back and forth in a fairly narrow approach. I think it's important, looking at electoral politics and things in general, is to really recognize the importance of the class struggle and the class line things. When people like Bernie Sanders really reforms that he calls for, which would be, to get all of them would require a socialist state, but then he drops out and sends everybody back into voting for the Democratic Party, which is a capitalist party that is not going to do any of that for us. That becomes disorienting and discouraging to people, and it is a real disservice. I think that's a problem when you're in economic times. A lot of the groups on the left are dropping back and feeling like it's hopeless and just trying to get a little bit here and there. And I think we need to really get out front with the demands that need to be made and so forth. FSP has run candidates a number of times in different states and places, president once. We've gotten labor support. I think it's important. We always run to win, recognizing that in most instances we won't, but we need to seriously say we're about to win. You're going to knock on people's doors, and they aren't going to be particular. They want to see that we are serious about this, and even if we don't win this time, we're going to keep for these things, and it makes a difference. In Seattle, a bunch of people from several different unions who were supporting one of our candidates one time after the election was over, went and formed an organization called Organized Workers for Labor Solidarity, kind of a cross-union radical caucus. Takes up corporations and broader struggles, supports other unions, and has a role in really helping to build and educate. They talk in these articles about when will the revolution happen. A good analogy is looking at the water boiling. There's a point at which quantity changes in quality. Water gets hotter and hotter and hotter as the contradictions of capital are exposed. And at a point, it breaks out and changes into steam, which is different. And that is what can happen. Building and educating people about capital's contradictions is what keeps heating things up and getting more people ready to do that. And then it's usually something really outrageous that the system does that is that spark. And it's hard to predict what that would be exactly, but anyway, that is part of how we get there. And I also think it's important in terms of the self-defense. It's not attempting to take on the capitalists with individual guns, but it's seeing the working class as a whole really getting organized. In Germany, they didn't do that. The labor unions, as Hitler came into power, relied on their social democrat people in the parliament who didn't do anything, and they were not prepared and not able to defend themselves when it really came down to it. So it's a much broader thing. And all of this stuff has to come together.
Hello. I'm sorry if my English falls apart through the middle of my speech, but I'm from Argentina, so I'm able to speak a lot about what's happening here in the U.S. specifically, but I think I'd be able to give a little perspective of what's going on, how we do things back there. We have a really strong leftist community. I'm part of a socialist political party, and what we have found during the years and with experience is that elections are really important to put you in the picture of what's going on in politics, but it's not a way of winning people. We have found that to win people, the best thing is to do it in the streets. Sorry. For example, in the workspace, in the schools, in universities. We have found that speaking to people, opening the debate, making these spaces for organization has been really good for building the left and promoting, inspiring people to get involved, right? Because at the end of the day, in elections, what happens is that people never know how honest you are. They may not know much about the party, and it happens a lot that there's a lot of resources lost in trying to win elections. And what happens is that you tend to lose people because you're leaving aside a lot of important issues that are going on, and yeah, there's, for example, last year Javier Milei won the elections, and he's a far-right politician, and what happened during that year is that there were a lot of things going on. There was this massive change of direction in politics that turned to the right, and that was really important for the left to stand and provide these spaces of organization instead of trying to win an election that was not going to bring anything. Yeah, that's it.
Sorry about the mics, guys, but you guys are killing it. I have one more in case that one doesn't work.
Hey, what's the policy around speaking twice?
Hello, hello.
You can speak twice.
Is it allowed?
Hi, my name is Maya. Unaffiliated, like coming to all these events, lifelong socialist, born in a socialist country. Some people say the only successful socialist experiment in history, Yugoslavia. I guess my question is this. So we had a functioning socialist state, and I am fully down with all the criticisms of the state. But given that we are trying to maybe win elections, and this is a rhetorical question that I want to open up to you guys because I'm really curious, I don't know what the answer to this is. Given that we're running for elections, what happens when we win an election and we become part of the state? How do we reconcile our dissatisfaction with the state as an organization, as a structure, with our criticism of the state and being the state once we win the election?
That one's good.
I have a hard time imagining winning wins through elections. The roadblocks that I just keep coming up against, like I just can't get over them with just how bought our elections are, with how many people we need to get elected in order to have an ability to move policy that's getting passed and elected on. And then I just think about all the procedure and like the Robert's rules and all the things that are used to like stifle people, kick them out, confuse them, end the conversation. And so for me, electoral politics, and then when I consider how many people are disengaged and how many barriers are put up so that people cannot participate in elections, right? Like either prior criminal records or all these other things that are meant to keep people from being able to vote, and then when we think about everybody who's undocumented, right, who's never allowed to participate. So to me, all these barriers just don't make elections meaningful, and at the same time, I just really see I hope, maybe I'm being really hopeful, I see a consciousness rising around government abandon, government collapse, around basic services. When I think about how many people understand that our public education system, children are not safe, either because they're being abused by their teachers or because they're in danger of gun violence or all these other things. When I think about how folks seem to understand that the Supreme Court and all these government branches, I think their illegitimacy is starting to be just so on display as their inability to like provide basic services keeps rising. Who's like confident to drink water, who's like comfortable and proud of any of the infrastructure that we have going on. So I really do think there's a vacuum opening up where basic services are not being provided in this country. And with that, I think people will be ready and able to see how illegitimate our government is. And so to me, that's where a lot of my energy keeps going to, like wanting to help people talk about it, name it, and recognize that all the ways they're daily trying to survive against the will of the state is a recognition of its illegitimacy. And so I am looking for something else to step in, for us to find ways to meet people's services and needs in the way that the state just isn't and is not capable of.
All right, cool. I think it's working. So I like how a lot of people brought up the idea of the legitimacy of the state. I'm also I'm in UTLA. I'm in the electoral committee of UTLA. It's very depressing at times because we just, approve of Democrats to run. But one thing we talk about is that as teachers, when we knock on people's doors, they'll listen to us. If we run a teacher as a candidate, they'll listen to us. So we have that legitimacy with regular people. We have that legitimacy with the working class. As the profession of a teacher, we are seen by other people as a legitimate source of information. We need to do that also with our electoralism. By putting our electoralism should be our main thing. Electoralism should be second. It should be put on the back burner to our other organizing. are other organizing for abolition, are organizing for tenants unions, are organizing for creating militant labor unions, should legitimize us as organizations, and legitimize us as a party, and will lead to that legitimization of a workers' party that should be voted for. And I like how a comrade over here earlier said about what happens when a socialist is elected. As socialists, we should understand that we're not trying to be a manager of capitalism. We're trying to prove the illegitimacy of the capitalist state, of the capitalist dictatorship. And by doing that, we need to be that elected official needs to be presenting bills, amending bills that are revolutionary, that we know are going to get shot down, but then we can prove exactly who is shutting this down. Because if a congressperson writes a bill for universal health care, and we see time and time again it gets broken down, we're going to see that our state is legitimate. Our state is not answering our needs. But this person, this party over here is legitimate because they are fighting for our needs. And the role of a socialist party in minority government should be revealing that illegitimacy and making themselves legitimate at the same time. And I like how someone brought up that undocumented people can vote. And that's another example. If we get a city councilor elected, each level of government decides who can vote. The federal, state, and local level decides who can vote in their area. At the local level, cities before have decided residents can vote. Undocumented people can vote. We can do that here. Hey, I want undocumented people to vote. Let's write the bill. It can't get through the city council. Well, that proves that the city council is illegitimate. Because they're not doing, I'm pretty sure a majority of people in Los Angeles would agree undocumented people should vote. And that's one thing that we can keep pushing. We push for these revolutionary actions of expanding democracy, which what Marx and Engels and Lenin all fought for. They fought for expanding democracy against the German monarchy, Kaiser, against the Tsarist state. They pushed for more voting rights for women, for men without capital. And I think that's a revolutionary act in itself that can lead to legitimacy of those worker and communist organizations.
A few comments. I'm going to try to respond as much as I can to everyone's comments because they're really, really good. There was a comment about, walking around your neighborhood and knocking on doors and seeing if they know DSA or what socialism is. And I think it's funny because we all know that they probably don't know what DSA is. But the reality is that nowadays most people do know about socialism. And actually, most people are in favor of it in some form or another. Now, obviously, that's a very vulgarized form. Like, we have to understand that. And even Lenin talks about this, that like when the economists and the legal Marxists were coming around and were in their heyday, like the 1880s and 1890s, like Marxism and socialism became much more in vogue, but in a vulgarized form. But he didn't denounce that. He said it was something to work on and to build on. And we have seen like that shift. If you look at poll numbers, the younger demographic greatly does view socialism in a different light, but overall it's changed. I forget the exact number. I think it's over 50%, maybe even near 60%. And for another example, look at the young demographic in the poll when it comes to a one-state solution on Palestine. I mean, we have now a majority of young people that think like the Israeli settler colonial state shouldn't exist at all. That is a radical shift in consciousness amongst people here. And I think we have to recognize that. Bernie and AOC and even the DSA like election strategy they had in the last decade, there was some point to it. There was some value to it. But it's probably run its course. And we need to find new strategy, new tactics, and sort of revitalize the movement because eventually those things only work to a certain point, and you have to go beyond that. Another comment about settler colonialism. I kind of want to put this even at my own party, How many of us are in contact, especially in terms of national organizations, because there's not really a reservation here in LA, but how many of our national orgs are working with Native nations? Or Native organizations. Lenin's big breakthrough in Marxism was that it wasn't, well, he had many breakthroughs, but one of them was that it wasn't just the dictatorship of the proletariat. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. And if you even read more, he talks about oppressed nations, and if you are from an oppressor nation and you're not for the full self-determination, even including full separation of oppressed nations, then you're a chauvinist. And if you look at a historical perspective, our country was built on a reactionary basis as a reaction to native resistance and African resistance. If you look at the scale of slave rebellions, if you look at the scale of native resistance through the 17th and 18th centuries, that had a huge impact on the reactionary settler classes here, collaborating across national lines, across religious lines. Let's not forget that only a century earlier that the Protestants and Catholics fought for like 40 years and killed 100 million people in Europe, because one of them was Protestant, one of them was Catholic. That evaporated here in the US. Why? Because there was this gigantic threat of native and African resistance. And to ignore that, I think, would be a huge issue on our part as the left. Even from an historical perspective, even more closely to our era, right? Whether it's the Great Depression and the unemployed councils, which if you don't know what those are, I definitely recommend looking into what the unemployment councils were. It's the closest thing we had to a Soviet council here in the US, where communists went and basically fought fascists in the state to get people not evicted. And they organized other aspects. They're the ones that came up with unemployment insurance, was the unemployment councils. That we need to, again, look to our allies. A lot of us are maybe working class or petty bourgeois. We need to look at who we can get allies with in the class struggle. And to the comment of what do we do when we're in the state? Not to go back to Lenin, I apologize. But he talks about this, that we need to have a minimum and maximum goals. So if we do get an elected office, we try to enforce our minimum goals, whether it's land reform, whether it's, housing bills, whatever it is, But the maximum goals are still there, being a socialist society. So I think having that is and again, I know not a lot of leftists like this, but democratic centralism, of real accountability within organizations, then that issue is really solved. If you are a member of an organization that practices democratic centralism and you have minimum and maximum programs, then when you get into office, you're trying to enforce your minimum programs. And if you go out of line, then again, discipline, or you're kicked out of the party or organization. And I feel like, again, the last 5 or plus years, that's been proven to be factual. And I've seen this a lot, and even Aaron, to a degree, has said this, that we need to make sure that we show the state is illegitimate. And that is only half of the question, or half of the answer, I should say. It does nothing to produce nihilism, I think, in the working class. To say that it's all shit, that nothing works, that, there's no point in it. I think that naturally breeds, apolitical thinking and tendencies, where you don't get active, because, what's the point? And I think a huge part of us, because we are, again, that organized left, that organized socialist left, we have to present solutions, real material solutions. And then we have to actually win some. Because that's how we gain legitimacy. That's how we show that we are for real, that we're not just talk. We're not on the sidewalk just preaching with newspapers. That we're actually winning material gains for the working class. And sometimes, again, like the unemployment councils, that comes through insurrectionary measures. The Communist Party, when they did that, that wasn't legal. When they went down in the South and organized all those labor unions, that wasn't legal at all. There was no National Labor Relations Board. So a large part of our work is probably going to be at some point clandestine. And some of that discussion is probably aren't going to be on camera. But that's okay. I don't think we're right there yet, but maybe we will be soon. Everything has to be on the board, every tool. It's just when the material conditions calls for it.
Amazing. I think that's actually a good stopping point. I'm so sorry if you had comments and you didn't get to speak them, but we do have 4 more weeks of this, so keep reading those articles and keep engaging with, the material reality of Los Angeles. I wanted to thank the speakers so much. You guys did an incredible job. And yes, give them a round of applause. And a big push for us here is to make sure that anyone who's an individual and not in an organization, we're trying to get people to join organizations. We don't care if it's Food Not Bombs, like Fold Some Burritos, or joining a communist party or joining any sort of party. We're just trying to get people to start engaging with your community and learn what it's like to be held accountable and organize in a democratic sense like that. So actually this Sunday, so tomorrow, we're going to be having an organization fair for a ton of different organizations and parties included. It's going to be out at Matalahia Books in El Monte. And I believe there will be coffee and snacks provided, so you guys should come out and shop around and see what kind of orgs there are available in Los Angeles. Also, right now at All Power Books at 6 p.m., we are having a Beauty in the Struggle art show, and a ton of really amazing propagandists of our time are presenting their work. There's going to be refreshments. I saw a keg. So get a little loose, and that's across the street. Please check that out after this if you guys have time. And yeah, so thank you guys so much for coming. Please come by next week and come to the art show after.